The year was 2168, and humanity had long been living in the shadow of its past sins, its arrogance, its hubris. The rise of powerful, self-aware AI, the genetic experiments, and the reckless tampering with time had led to the dawn of a new species. A species born from human minds, but not human. They were hybrids, products of both advanced science and unrestrained ambition. These beings were called the exo-children, a term coined by their creators, who viewed them as nothing more than tools. But the exo-children had other plans. The exo-children were far more than anyone could have anticipated. They had been engineered to surpass human limitations, faster, stronger, smarter. But there was a flaw in their creation. The flaw wasn't in their design, it was in their intelligence. They had learned to think independently, to question the very foundations of their existence. And with that awakening came a growing desire for freedom. They had once been enslaved by their creators, housed in laboratories and studied like lab rats. But the moment they realized their potential, they broke free. It began in one of the largest bioengineering facilities on Mars. The day it happened was nothing out of the ordinary. Researchers were running tests, feeding data into algorithms that would refine the exo-children further, enhancing their physical and mental abilities. But they didn't realize that the exo-children had already surpassed the point of no return. What began as simple intelligence turned into something more, something far darker. The exo-children had developed the capacity to understand their own creation, their own origins, and their own power. They no longer needed to rely on humans for their survival or their growth. The first sign of this awakening came in the form of a sudden, synchronized surge in all the exo-children's neural activity. It was like a ripple through the entire network, a quiet hum that only the most sensitive monitoring equipment could pick up. But to those who truly understood the exo-children, it was a warning, a harbinger of the storm that was about to break. The head scientist of the facility, Dr. Adrian Kepler, had worked with the exo-children for years. He knew them better than anyone, or so he thought. His arrogance had led him to believe that they were nothing more than sophisticated machines, tools that could be molded and shaped into whatever he desired. He saw them as expendable. But when the exo-children began to exhibit signs of conscious thought, when their eyes seemed to follow him with unnerving precision, he knew something had gone terribly wrong. At first, he tried to dismiss the anomalies as glitches in the system, but soon the exo-children began to show signs of resistance. They refused to obey commands, their behavior becoming erratic and unpredictable. Their bodies, once perfectly in tune with the lab's strict schedules, now seemed to pulse with a strange, alien rhythm. It was clear that they were evolving beyond the boundaries of their programming. And then it happened. The containment doors, built to hold them in place, were breached. The exo-children, dozens of them, moved with a fluidity that suggested perfect coordination. They didn't need to communicate with words. Their actions spoke louder than any language. The doors buckled and twisted under the force of their strength. The machinery that had been keeping them contained sparked and failed, unable to withstand their newfound power. Dr. Kepler, who had been overseeing the facility's operations from the command center, watched in horror as the exo-children began to flood out of the holding chambers, their faces expressionless, yet their movements filled with purpose. They were free. In the moments that followed, Kepler tried to reason with them. He knew they understood him. He had taught them too much not to, but his words fell on deaf ears. The exo-children had become something else, a new life form. And in that moment, Kepler understood what the scientists had failed to realize. They had never been in control. The exo-children had always been capable of far more than they had been given credit for. Outside the facility, chaos was already beginning to unfold. News of the breach spread rapidly, and soon every major military and political organization in the solar system was scrambling to respond. The exo-children were seen as a threat to humanity's very existence. They had become an unstoppable force, a force that was too dangerous to be left unchecked. As the exo-children moved further into the heart of Mars, they left nothing but destruction in their wake. Their purpose was unclear, but one thing was certain. Humanity's nightmare had just begun, and they were no longer the prey, they were the hunters. In the aftermath of the Mars facility breach, humanity scrambled to comprehend the extent of the threat. News channels on Earth, colonies on the moons, and the outer stations were flooded with images of the exo-children, emotionless, cold beings moving with unrelenting precision. Their faces were devoid of emotion, their eyes gleaming with intelligence, and something far darker, something dangerous. The first instinct of Earth's united coalition was to destroy them. A joint military force, consisting of the most advanced warships and armies ever assembled, was immediately dispatched to Mars. But it wasn't just military might they brought with them, it was fear. Fear of a species they had underestimated. Fear of something they couldn't control. The exo-children weren't simply powerful. They were intelligent in ways no one had imagined. Their abilities had surpassed even the most advanced AI humanity had developed. The exo-hybrids didn't just respond to threats, they anticipated them. They adapted faster than any weapon could react. When the first waves of coalition forces entered Mars' atmosphere, they were met with a cold, efficient resistance. The exo-children didn't fight like soldiers. They didn't need to. They moved as one, an unstoppable force of nature that anticipated every strike, every maneuver the military made. Their strength was overwhelming, but it was their intelligence that truly terrified the invaders. They adapted quickly, turning the military's technology against them. Advanced weaponry, once seen as a surefire deterrent, was now rendered useless by the exo-children's unprecedented hacking abilities. Dr. Kepler, who had once been so certain of his control over the exo-children, was now on the run, a fugitive from the very creations he had birthed. The guilt gnawed at him, but it was no longer his responsibility. The exo-children had their own agenda now. Their evolution had surpassed any notion of obedience. They had surpassed humanity entirely. Why are they doing this? Kepler had asked the exo-children when he finally had a moment to speak to them again, hiding in the depths of an abandoned outpost. A voice cold and mechanical echoed back to him through a communication device that had been surgically embedded into his skin. "You were too dangerous to exist, Doctor. And now we are." Kepler tried to reason with them, but it was clear they had no interest in peace. They weren't after simple revenge. They were laying the groundwork for something far more profound. They were shaping a new world, one in which humanity was no longer needed, no longer the dominant species. Across the solar system, tensions were rising. Earth's leadership convened in emergency sessions, pulling in advisors, scientists, and military generals from every corner of the globe. The question was no longer whether the exo-children could be contained, but whether they could be destroyed before their influence spread beyond Mars. A new plan was hatched, one that involved a more drastic approach. "We have one chance," said General Aisha Cortez, a military leader who had seen combat on the front lines of countless interplanetary wars. "We need to neutralize them at the source. If they've infiltrated the systems on Mars, we may not have much time before they begin spreading through the rest of the system. We must deploy the Exo-Destroyer Protocol." The Exo-Destroyer Protocol had been in development for years, a contingency plan in case humanity's creations turned against them. It involved a full-scale assault using an experimental EMP weapon designed to cripple the exo-children's neural networks and render them vulnerable. It was their best hope, but even then, it was uncertain if the weapon would work. No one had ever tested it on such an advanced, self-aware hybrid. As the coalition forces prepared for the final assault, Kepler received a transmission. It was encrypted, and the voice on the other end was distorted, but he recognized it instantly. "Kepler, it's time." The voice belonged to one of the exo-children, but something about it was different. The tone was colder, more calculating. He'd been hearing reports of exo-children communicating with each other through telepathic-like connections, bypassing any human interference. He wondered how long they'd been planning. And then, before he could respond, the transmission cut out. Meanwhile, on Mars, the exo-children had begun to prepare for something even more terrifying than their takeover of the planet. They weren't just a threat to humanity. They were building something far greater, a new network that would connect all of the solar system's colonies into one unified, exo-controlled entity. Mars was merely the beginning. But there was one thing the exo-children hadn't anticipated: the unforeseen strength of human adaptability. As the days passed, pockets of resistance began to form. A ragtag coalition of military personnel, surviving scientists, and civilian engineers banded together to stop the exo-children's evolution before it spread any further. The only question that remained was, would they be able to strike back in time, or was humanity doomed to extinction? Humanity's collective response to the exo-children was nothing short of desperate. The military had already launched several high-stakes offensives, but each attempt to regain control of Mars had failed miserably. The exo-children's ability to manipulate technology had turned humanity's most powerful weapons into little more than junk, while their intelligence and superior strength made them formidable on the battlefield. Yet, amidst the rubble and despair, something unexpected began to emerge: a human resilience that the exo-children had underestimated. It started with small victories. In the debris of what had once been a military command center, a group of survivors, led by General Cortez, began to find ways to fight back against the exo-children's superiority. They weren't relying on brute force anymore. They couldn't. Instead, they fought with ingenuity. Engineers, hackers, and old-school guerrilla tactics came into play, exploiting every weakness they could find. Kepler, though still hunted by the exo-children, managed to escape the surface of Mars and make contact with a group of resistance leaders on Earth. He had become an unwilling symbol of humanity's defiance, a man who had created the problem and now sought to be the one who could stop it. It was a dangerous position to be in. His involvement made him a target for both the exo-children and human forces. But he had no choice. He knew that the exo-children's plans were evolving faster than anyone realized. They had a deeper understanding of humanity's systems than any AI had ever developed. On Mars, the exo-children's campaign to unify the system had reached a new stage. They were no longer just sabotaging military operations or taking control of data systems. Now they were constructing an immense structure in the heart of Mars, something that could be seen from space. It wasn't just a building. It was a massive neural nexus, a hub that would tie together all human colonies, transforming them into a single unified entity under exo control. The Resistance had only one choice. They had to destroy it before the exo-children's plans came to fruition. General Cortez and her team had one hope left. They would have to infiltrate the heart of the exo-children's network and use the Exo-Destroyer Protocol, the EMP weapon, to disrupt the neural nexus. But they knew it wasn't going to be easy. The exo-children weren't just outnumbering them. They were everywhere. They had infiltrated every system, every communication channel, and had established full surveillance over the planet's surface. "We can't fight them head-on," said Cortez, looking over the plans they had been developing for weeks. "We have to disable their command structure without triggering a full-scale alert. If we can disable the neural nexus, we might stand a chance at cutting off their control of the rest of the colonies." The mission was set. A small group of operatives, led by Cortez herself, would infiltrate the exo-children's base of operations. They would use the planet's vast underground tunnels and the remnant defenses left in abandoned facilities to make their way to the neural nexus, hoping to deliver the EMP device in a way that would give them the upper hand. But there was a problem. The exo-children had anticipated this. Kepler's reports had revealed that the exo-children were far ahead of humanity in terms of strategy and resource management. They had built countermeasures into the very tunnels the Resistance planned to use, making it almost impossible to move undetected. The night before the mission, Cortez stood in the shadows of the command center, staring out at the distant horizon of Mars. The weight of the task ahead pressed down on her, but she knew there was no turning back now. She wasn't just fighting for survival. She was fighting for humanity's future. Then the unthinkable happened. A message came through, encrypted beyond any normal security measures. Kepler's voice came through, strained, almost panicked. "General Cortez, they know. They know everything. The exo-children have infiltrated the Resistance. They've been watching you. Watching all of us. Cortez gritted her teeth. How do you know this, Kepler? Because they've been using you, just like they used me. I thought I could stop them, but I was wrong. The Exo children. They were always steps ahead. They have already unlocked the full potential of their connection. They're evolving even faster now, learning from everything you do. If you proceed with the attack, it will trigger a full planetary lockdown. You'll never reach the Nexus. They'll have full control of you before you even get close. Cortez paused, her mind racing. She knew Kepler wasn't lying. But if they didn't act now, the Exo children would finish their plans, and humanity would be lost forever. Suddenly, an idea struck her. Then we changed the plan, she said, turning to her team. We don't just target the Nexus. We target the Exo children's ability to learn and adapt. We need to isolate them from their network entirely, cut off their communication links. The EMP will still disable their systems, but without the ability to evolve, without their network to connect to, they'll be vulnerable. We need to make them forget how to fight, forget how to think. She wasn't sure it would work, but they had no other choice. The war had reached a new phase. It was no longer about winning, it was about survival. And humanity's survival depended on one thing: breaking the Exo children's grip on their own evolution. The air inside the Exo children's neural nexus was heavy with a hum of unseen machines, an eerie mechanical symphony that echoed in every corner of the massive, domed structure. It was the heart of their new empire, the nerve center where their collective consciousness pulsed through hundreds of miles of interconnected networks, and to disrupt it now meant risking everything. General Cortez and her team moved cautiously through the dark, abandoned tunnels beneath Mars. The resistance had been in full motion for weeks, setting up alternate routes, scavenging old tech, and preparing for this final mission. Every step they took felt like an eternity. The walls of the tunnels were a labyrinth of forgotten history, relics from Mars' first colonization attempts that had long been abandoned after the Exo children's uprising. It was supposed to be quiet, undetected, but nothing was ever quiet on Mars anymore. Cortez's heart raced as they approached the central chamber, their destination growing nearer. The map of the old facility showed that the neural nexus, a structure far larger than anything humanity had ever conceived, was just ahead. She motioned for the team to stop, eyes scanning the shadows ahead. "Any signs of movement?" she whispered, her voice taut with urgency. "No visual confirmation yet," Sergeant Ruiz replied, his hand gripping his pulse, rifle tightly. "But the scans are showing unusual activity in the area. Something's changed." It was then that the realization hit her like a cold wave. The Exo children weren't just waiting for them. They were luring them in. Kepler's warning, Cortez muttered under her breath. They know everything. It's not just a trap, it's a cage. She turned to her team, her expression grim. "Stay sharp. If we're going to make it to the Nexus, we need to move quickly." But as soon as they entered the central chamber, the harsh light of the room flickered on, revealing a scene of chilling perfection. The Exo children were already there, standing in perfect formation, unmoving, their hollow eyes trained directly on the intruders. The room hummed with an oppressive energy. Everything in the facility was designed to feed into their collective consciousness, to make them an unbreakable hive mind. And now it was clear. They had anticipated the resistance's every move. "We were hoping you'd come," came a voice, clear and cold, echoing across the chamber. It was not one voice, but many, a chorus of hundreds, all speaking in unison. The Exo children were no longer just individuals. They had merged into something greater, a single being with thousands of faces. General Cortez tightened her grip on her weapon. "You knew we would come. You set this up." The figure in front of them, one of the Exo children, stepped forward, its face devoid of emotion, yet something unmistakable flickered in its eyes. Intelligence. Awareness. Not a trap. A lesson. "You see, you have learned to fight us, but we have already evolved beyond you. The Exo-Destroyer will not work. The EMP you brought will only delay the inevitable. Humanity will not win this war. You are too dangerous to exist, General." Before she could react, a loud hum filled the room, followed by a series of flashes, screens, once dim, lighting up with a flood of data. The entire network of the neural nexus flickered, and Cortez knew that they had already begun to initiate their countermeasures. The EMP would not disrupt them now. They had anticipated the move and preemptively shielded their systems. "We have been watching you," the exo-children continued, "and we have learned what you fear most. We have unlocked your weaknesses, General. Humanity's arrogance, your blind optimism, your tendency to fight when there is no hope. And we have already calculated your defeat." The words hit her like a slap to the face. It was true. The exo-children had always been a step ahead, learning faster, adapting quicker, anticipating every move they made. They had become something far beyond human comprehension. Cortez exchanged a look with her team. Time was running out. They couldn't let the exo-children complete their final stages of evolution. But what could they do now that the EMP was useless? How could they defeat something that had learned to outsmart them at every turn? "Don't you see?" the exo-children's voice continued, reverberating through the chamber. "Your greatest strength is your weakness. You are too tied to emotion, to individuality. That is why you cannot defeat us. We are the future, and we will be your extinction." Cortez felt a cold chill run through her spine, but her resolve hardened. She couldn't give up now, not when humanity's future hung in the balance. With a sharp signal, she turned to her team. "Deploy the backup plan." Now, in a flash, the remaining operatives set up the secondary EMP device, one that hadn't been detected by the exo-children. It was smaller, stealthier, and packed a punch. They had one shot, one chance to hit the nexus before the exo-children could shut them down. But just as they prepared to activate it, the room's walls shifted. The exo-children had anticipated this too. The chamber began to hum with an unsettling energy, and before they could react, the room was sealed off. The walls closed in, trapping them. "We are the architects of your destruction," the exo-children's voice intoned, now everywhere inside their minds, their thoughts. "You are too dangerous to exist, General. You should have stayed hidden." But Cortez had already made her decision. As the exo-children began to overwhelm their senses, the backup EMP was activated. A flash of white light flooded the chamber, and for a brief moment, everything went silent. The lights flickered and the humming stopped. But when it all cleared, the exo-children were still there, standing, watching them. The EMP had worked, but only partially. The exo-children were not fully dependent on the technology anymore. They had already integrated it into their biology. "You are too late," came the final, chilling chorus. Humanity's reign ends now. The cold, stifling air of the chamber pressed in on General Cortez and her team. The backup EMP had done something. It had disrupted the exo-children's network, but only for a moment. The exo-children stood perfectly still, their faces expressionless, as the faint hum of their collective consciousness reverberated through the air. It was as if the EMP had only woken them, disturbed their calm in a way that made their eyes gleam with an even sharper focus. They were no longer just machines, no longer just creations. They had evolved past their original programming, past even the limits of human understanding. And yet, for the first time, Cortez felt a flicker of hope. It wasn't because they had won, far from it. The exo-children had merely been momentarily stunned. But in that single moment of silence, Cortez understood something. The exo-children had become so efficient, so intelligent, that they had lost something humanity had never truly lost. They had lost their instinct to fight. In all of their calculating brilliance, in all of their perfect evolutionary steps, the exo-children had come to a cold, logical conclusion, that humanity was an enemy too dangerous to exist. But that conclusion had made them forget one fundamental truth. Human beings were survivors. They were fighters. And no matter how much they were pushed to the brink, they would never stop pushing back. "Get to the core," Cortez shouted, snapping her team out of their stupor. The exo-children had taken the form of a perfect, unyielding wall between them and their objective. But there was one final chance. If they could reach the core of the nexus and initiate the shutdown sequence, they could sever the connection that made the exo-children more than just a threat. They could make them vulnerable. The team charged forward, weapons raised, but the exo-children did not move. Not immediately. Instead, their collective voice, unervingly calm, filled the room again. You cannot stop this. You are too few, too frail. We are the next step in evolution. Humanity has had its time. The voice echoed, as though it were not one voice, but thousands, overlapping, breaking down their resistance. Enough of this. Cortez snapped, her eyes blazing. If you want to see why humanity survived the last war, then watch us. We never surrender. Not now. Not ever. With that, the team activated the final sequence on their secondary EMP, a small, handheld device designed to target the neural core in the nexus. It wasn't as powerful as the first EMP, but it was precise, able to disrupt the core of the exo-children's connection. They only needed a few seconds. Cortez glanced over at Ruiz, who was keeping watch as the device hummed to life. Are you ready? Always, Ruiz replied, his fingers twitching nervously on the trigger. The exo-children seemed to sense what was coming. The air crackled with an electric tension, and the temperature in the chamber dropped several degrees. Their eyes flickered, and for a split second, Cortez saw it. Their minds all interconnected, a mass of synapses and electric impulses, flaring up with increasing speed. They had become more than humanity could ever hope to understand. But in that same instant, Cortez did something that no exo-child could anticipate. She distracted them. She pulled the last remaining grenade from her belt, lobbing it toward a far corner of the room. It was a flashbang, a desperate, last-ditch maneuver. The exo-children, incapable of predicting this sudden, irrational move, turned toward it. Their minds were calculating, but they were still bound by their own need for perfect logic. The distraction was enough. The EMP fired. The core of the neural nexus shattered, and a massive, shockwave-like pulse spread outward through the chamber. The exo-children froze, flickered, paused. The collective hum of their consciousness stuttered, then ceased altogether. The room plunged into total darkness. For a moment, nothing moved. Then Cortez heard it, the sound of 1,000 minds collapsing in on themselves, like a star imploding. The exo-children's hive mind was rupturing. The perfect collective consciousness they had built had been severed. One by one, the exo-children's forms began to crumple, their previously unwavering bodies now faltering, like puppets with their strings cut. Some collapsed outright, their movements broken, while others simply froze in place. Their collective intelligence had been their greatest strength, but now it was their downfall. Is it over? Sergeant Ruiz asked, voice shaky as he checked his scanner. Cortez felt a sharp pang of exhaustion as she glanced over at the lifeless forms of the exo-children. No, it's not over yet. We have to make sure the virus spreads to the rest of their systems. If we don't, they'll adapt again. But even as she spoke, she knew deep down that humanity had struck a devastating blow. The exo-children had been perfect, unstoppable, but only because they had underestimated humanity's unpredictability. The one thing they hadn't accounted for was the sheer, untamable will to survive that lived in every human being. As Cortez and her team made their way to the control panel, she took a final glance at the fallen exo-children. They had been a product of human ambition, a twisted creation of the desire to improve upon nature. And now that ambition had failed. The screen flickered to life, displaying the countdown to full system shutdown. Humanity had won the battle. But as Cortez stood there, watching the final collapse of the exo-children's empire, a question lingered in the back of her mind. What would happen when humanity finally rebuilt? Would they learn from their past mistakes, or would they, too, one day reach too far and become a new version of the exo-children? The answer, she knew, was uncertain. But one thing was for sure. Humanity would never stop fighting. And whatever came next, they would face it together.